It sure feels good to be back in the heart of Dixie.
Today, President Ronald Reagan came to Montgomery, the first time a sitting president has addressed a joint session of the Alabama legislature. Tonight, we'll take you from Mr. Reagan's airport arrival, through his speech, a private reception with state Republicans, and his departure from Maxwell Air Force Base. Also, we'll have reactions from supporters and those who object to the president's programs. All of this on tonight's news, and including a WSFA TV News special report, the presidential visit tonight at 10:30.
The protest started with close to 100 people and swelled to about 300 when the president was to begin speaking at around 11 o'clock this morning. The demonstrators took their protest from the steps of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church to the barricades in front of the state capitol. The protesters were met by several Montgomery police officers who told the group they had the authority to block the Dexter Avenue entrance to the Capitol, but their protest continued. As they had done earlier in the morning, members sang anti-Reagan songs, denounced his new federalism and budget plans, and carried signs supporting ERA and blasting Reaganomics. But the demonstrating won't stop in Montgomery. Members of the All People's Conference say about 50 to 100,000 people will be marching to the nation's capital, protesting the war in El Salvador and Reaganomics. Then in May, the newly organized coalition goes to the opening of the World's Fair, which the president is supposed to kick off.
It'll be a coalition of everyone who is adversely affected by the Reagan administration.
How many people do you think will assemble there?
I can't tell at all. There's a coalition in Knoxville which is just formed to call the demonstration. All People's Congress and the National Days of Resistance Coalition wants to support that and bring people from around the South. It's just got underway and we cannot predict it at all. I think there'll be a lot of people there.
The World's Fair opens in Knoxville, Tennessee, May 1st. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church.
Under extremely tight security, 131 of the state's 140 legislators listened to the nation's 40th president. President Reagan spent the first portion of his speech complimenting Governor James, his oil windfall investment plan, and other aspects of this state's government. The president also committed to provide support for the completion of the Tennessee-Tombigbee Waterway. The compliments then led to what the president was here to do, drum up support for his new federalism program.
Would you not agree that we have strayed much too far from that noble beginning, and that the whole idea of our revolution, personal freedom, equality of opportunity, and keeping government close to the people, is threatened by a federal spending machine that takes too much money from the people, too much authority from the states, and yes, too much liberty with our Constitution?
But while the president was seeking support of his program, he also indicated some willingness to compromise.
There will always be room for improvement in any budget or economic policy, but we must have a budget. Where further savings are to be found or a better way of meeting agreed upon goals can be worked out, I pledge my full cooperation to the members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and I want to hear from them.
But President Reagan footnoted his possible concessions by saying defense spending wouldn't be a starting place for his reduced federal spending. One key area the president failed to get applause was on the program to turn many federal services back to state government control. The concern at the local level is being able to afford the control of administering these programs, but several state legislators said they might be open to seeing how that changeover would work before opposing it. The applause the president did receive on his proposals indicated some bipartisan support at the local level, something President Reagan is apparently hoping congressmen in Washington are hearing, and something more than the president might have expected from a legislature where only 4 of the 140 members are Republicans. Following his 30-minute appearance before the legislature, President Reagan went down to a meeting of Republicans, and Don Phelps was there.
Teaches us a valuable lesson. I have to interrupt here and say something about Bear Bryant and myself. Come and see how Alabama will take the nearly $450 million. Now, the other aspect of the plan is a turn back of responsibilities to the states for over 40 federal programs in education, community development, transportation, and social services, along with the resources to pay for them. In 1984, the federal government will apply the full proceeds from certain excise taxes to a grassroots trust fund that will belong in fair shares to the states. By 1988, the states will be in full control of these grant programs. Now, we're not wedded to every detail of this proposal. We want a dialogue. And I've been very grateful to have Governor James' strong support. And you'll be pleased to know that when the other governors met with me in Washington recently, one thing we're not trying to do is balance the federal budget on the backs of the states. There will be no need for net tax increases on citizens at the local level. Also, our proposal will not cause needy Americans to migrate to states with high welfare benefits. People migrate for...
The president was speaking. Of course, I walked out, of course, and I could not sit there and knowing that I represent a district that has an average annual income of $5,000 a year, and hear him talk about how he's going to give tax breaks to big rich people in this country and big corporations, and how he's going to cut various social programs and give them to the state to run. The state of Alabama would never treat black and poor people right. They never have, and they never will in this country. And I respect the office of the President of the United States, and I think...
What did the Republican Party get to do in being in large number? I have no idea. I do believe that the things that the people of Montgomery and Alabama will remember is not the speech, but rather the problem they had in seeing him. They wanted to see him, and they felt that they had a right to see the president, possibly in the limousine in a parade or down the street, but because of security reasons, they were not allowed into the Capitol, and then they couldn't see him on the route anyway, and then of course, I think that was a Republican fiasco, having that meeting at the Civic Center.
And his comments regarding me, he was exactly right, though, about this great state, and he was going to a Republican fusion there. I think his direction is right, and I think what he's doing is in the best interest of the American people and the people of my home state, Alabama. So I was delighted that he came here. I thought he told us what was on his mind and his heart, and I'm for it.
Do you think what he's calling for is tough enough to do what he wants to do, or should there be even more stringent measures taken?
Yes, I do. I think that we've got to cut the federal government some more. I think we can do it. I think there are many areas of costs, the fringes, retirement programs, built-in cost of living indexes for federal government employees that must be modified. Our major industries are going through a time now where they are having to modify benefits.
Under the tight security, virtually no spectators were allowed in the runway area where Air Force One was to land. Only news media representatives and a few state dignitaries were issued the passes to enter the special barricaded area. Governor Fob James and Alabama's First Lady Bobby James, along with Montgomery Mayor Emory Farmer, were among the few who could formally greet the president. The first plane to land was a special press plane carrying some 200 news media representatives who will report on the president's three-state tour to promote his new federalism. Just minutes after the news people were in place, Air Force One appeared on the horizon. Shortly after touchdown, the plane taxied to the press area where reporters learned that members of the state congressional delegation were also on board. Following the president out of Air Force One, Senator Jeremiah Denton, Congressman Bill Dickinson, and Senator Howell Heflin, among others. The president refused to talk to reporters and was briefly welcomed by Governor James and Mayor Farmer. Reagan's aides wasted no time in escorting the president to his limousine that had been flown into Montgomery last night, along with a special car for Secret Service agents. Within 5 minutes, the presidential motorcade led by Montgomery City Police was on the way to the state capitol for Reagan's address to a joint session of the Alabama legislature. Chris Grimshaw was there.
The exact number of law enforcement officers involved in the president's security is not known. However, officials estimate the figure to be near 300. That includes state troopers, city and county police officers, and Secret Servicemen. All areas along the presidential motorcade route were well protected. There were officers in the air, and on rooftops, as well as on the ground. Spectators were kept in cordoned-off areas on all sides of the Capitol, both before and after the president's arrival. Roadblocks were set up on several downtown streets. Montgomery Police Chief Charles Swindle says his officers had no trouble at all implementing security measures. He says the entire operation went perfectly. Dan Black, WSFA TV News.
Following his address to the joint session of the Alabama legislature, President Reagan came here to the Montgomery Civic Center to meet with about 250 Republicans and other invited guests. People who lined the streets to the Montgomery Civic Center got only a glimpse of the president as his motorcade pulled into the rear of the Civic Center. The reception was hosted by the Republican Party for members of the Republican Roundtable, whose membership requires a minimum contribution of $500 to the GOP. The reception was closed to the general public and reporters. Inside the Civic Center, guests saw the president's address to the legislature on TV. General Manager of WSFA TV, Chuck Whitehurst, who was invited to the reception, says the meeting with the president was very informal.
But I guess the most interesting thing, he talked about his plan for recovery, economic recovery, and he said everybody keeps criticizing the plan, and the plan hasn't even gone into operation yet. He still feels the plan will work. He still feels the tax cut is the way to get the country back on the proper track. It was a very interesting thing. It was sort of a press conference with no press.
The reception lasted about 20 minutes. Then Mr. Reagan was escorted from the Civic Center to his car and driven to Maxwell Air Force Base to continue his quest for grassroots support of his economic recovery plan. Most of the people who paid $500 to attend the meeting said it was worth it. They enjoyed meeting with the president and talking with him informally. And after all, on a trip that was supposed to be a selling job for his economic policies, there wasn't too much selling to be done today at the Montgomery Civic Center. Don Phelps, WSFA TV News.
Dismore. All right, thank you very much. Misspell name.
D-I-S-M-O-R-E.
Dismore. All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay.
To dispel a lot of the bad publicity that has been given to the federalism move, and that's returning things back to the state where the federal government never should have been involved in them in the first place. And I think there's been so much misinformation that he felt like coming to state legislatures direct and giving them the information firsthand it was a benefit, and I think it would be. Of course, this meeting here was completely secondary. His main purpose was to speak to the legislature.
President John Kennedy flew to the state during his presidential campaign. He met with then Governor John Patterson in Huntsville. The year was 1960. The two national Democratic candidates, Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy came back after he was elected president. This time he returned to the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. He was greeted there by then Governor George Wallace. This picture was made just as Kennedy stepped off the presidential helicopter in Huntsville. In 1971, it was Republican President Richard Nixon who came to Mobile. He was accompanied by family members Julie and David Eisenhower and Press Secretary Ron Nessen, standing at the top of the steps leading off Air Force One. President Nixon was again greeted by Governor Wallace. The president was in the state to discuss plans for the Tennessee-Tombigbee Waterway project. Nixon's visit attracted the state's political notables, as well as influential Republicans. The late Senator Jim Allen is standing directly behind the president as he bows to the crowd. Former First Lady Cornelia Wallace is to his right, and former Postmaster General Winton Blunt is also on the platform in Mobile. Richard Nixon came back to Mobile 2 years later, this time to be greeted by Wallace in a wheelchair, not many months after he was gunned down in the campaign of 1972. And 8 years later, Democrat Jimmy Carter chose Tuscumbia, Alabama on Labor Day in 1980 to kick off his unsuccessful re-election campaign.
Maxwell Air Force Base looked like the scene of a reporters' convention as hundreds of representatives of the news media gathered to report on President Reagan's Montgomery visit. In addition to state and local reporters, almost 200 members of the Washington Press Corps came by chartered jet in advance of the president's arrival at Maxwell. These are the reporters that will follow Reagan on his road trip to 3 southern states to promote his new federalism. With cameras in hand at the special media platform and typewriters clicking in a special hangar reserved for reporters, all waited for a chance to ask the president questions. We were all told that the president would not be available to talk to reporters because of his tight travel schedule, but as true gatherers of news, we all secretly hoped he might change his mind. This was not to be. Only minutes after leaving Air Force One and briefly greeting Governor Fob James and Montgomery Mayor Emory Palmer, the president, accompanied by members of the state congressional delegation, including Congressman Bill Dickinson, Senators Howell Heflin and Jeremiah Denton, stepped inside the special presidential limousine, and the motorcade left for the state capitol. Mac Carmack, WSFA TV News.
Under heavy security, the president was whisked from the Capitol down Tallapoosa Street to the Montgomery Civic Center. People who lined the street to see the president got only a brief glimpse as his limousine sped to the rear of the Civic Center. The reception was off limits to reporters and the general public. Mr. Reagan was scheduled to be at the reception for 30 minutes, but because of his late arrival from the state capitol, he only stayed 20. WSFA TV's general manager, Chuck Whitehurst, who was an invited guest, says the meeting was very informal.
But when the president came in, it was almost as though he wasn't prepared to say anything. He got up and said, I don't have a prepared text. I've already made my speech. So ask me what you want to ask me.
Montgomery County Commissioner Bill Joseph says the president's economic recovery plan was a major topic at the reception.
Well, he was, of course, that's very much on his mind, and he referred to the recession, inflation rate being down to around 3% last month and 5% in the last 4 or 5 months, and the fact that his program is just now really getting in gear, that all of the problems and the things of the high interest rates and all have been coming down since the program, that really didn't start the 1st of October, that his program got in gear.
From all accounts of the meeting inside, it appears the president left Montgomery on a positive note after meeting with friends and staunch supporters of his economic policies and his plan for new federalism. Reporting from the Montgomery Civic Center, Don Phelps, WSFA TV News.
Close to 100 members of the Coalition for Jobs, Justice, and Peace assembled at the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church around 9:30. Among the groups represented were the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, the All People's Conference, and the National Organization for Women. They sang anti-Reagan songs, carried anti-Reaganomics signs, and vowed to continue fighting the president's policies. Protesters also rallied in support of ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment Dave Dismore has been riding his bicycle across the country supporting ERA. His destination is Miami, Florida. Dismore says through his travels, Americans have told him they want the ERA passed.
I think we have an excellent chance. I'm a feminist, not a masochist. I wouldn't have started this if I didn't think we had a real chance of ratification.
Then around 11 o'clock, when the president was getting ready to address state lawmakers, the group moved toward the Capitol, where they were met by Montgomery police who told them they would not continue forward. The protesters then continued chanting anti-Reagan songs. But the protest doesn't stop here. Members of the All People's Conference are planning a march in Washington later this month and in Knoxville in May at the opening of the World's Fair, an event which the president is also expected to attend.
Because it's the poor people and the oppressed people of Central America that are dying in that war now that the United States is pushing. And poor people and oppressed people in this country are suffering because all our money is going to this huge military budget from all the social programs that people need for schools, medical care, education, jobs, and all the things that we've needed to work for over the years. They're taking and using, take all that money from them, using to kill people in Central America.
Group members say they'll be going to Knoxville for the opening of the World's Fair. That's May 1st. The president will be there, too, to kick off the fair. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church.
I think the president today touched the heartstrings of all Alabamians and all Americans as he spoke about the virtues of thrift and hard work that made this country and what it will take to save it again. The idea that the government that is closest to the people is the best government and is one that is shared by many Alabamians and many Americans, and I think that this was the thrust of his remarks in support of his federalism plan, which to most of us is just old federalism, the basis on which our country was founded. I think it was a superb speech, a tribute to Montgomery and a tribute to Alabama to have him here.
And I think a wonderful day for the President of the United States. In Washington, you don't get quite the mainstream God, country, family kind of environment you get in Alabama, and I know the President needed that kind of a reinforcement. If we don't hang in with the direction he's given us and give it enough time to work, I think we are dreaming and missing our perhaps last chance for survival. I think we're going to confirm here in Alabama with our present governor and our future governor, our legislature, and our people that the federal government and the nation can afford for government to be handed back in terms of responsibility and authority and the means through that special trust fund he referred to this morning to minister to the needs of those who must be ministered to.
We do live in a great country, we live in a great state, and we have truly been blessed. And the program that the President has in place now that Congress has voted for does take time. And as I've said to the members of the press in the Birmingham area, we do have to have some patience. Unemployment is too high, and we have to continue to take steps to get this unemployment down and to get interest rates down. Interest rates are coming down, not as fast as any of us would like to see them come down, but we're heading in the right direction, and it takes time, and regrettably it takes more time than any of us would like to see it necessary in order to achieve the goals that we think are better for all Americans, all Alabamians, all over the state, of this great state.
If he will get on interest rates, get interest rates down, then unemployment's going to come down. The key to it's interest rates, and I think he's got to address it. He has not really addressed high interest rates. The Federal Reserve System has always been responsive to presidential persuasion, and the interest rates are the key to bringing down unemployment. The construction business, the housing business, farmers will all benefit from lower interest rates.
Mayor is a Republican, and I'm a Democrat. We had him, and he had a schedule to meet, and I didn't want to cause any confusion. Our major industries are going through a time now where they are having to modify benefits, and I think government should discipline themselves as well. I also think that the Defense Department needs to do some house cleaning. I've said this for years. I'm a great believer in a strong defense, but I believe we could cut back on our defense spending some 5 to 10% and not sacrifice the defense strength of this country 1 degree. And I'm hopeful that he will move in that direction. I will advocate that. I will speak to that. I will urge him to do that. And we've seen interest rates drop some, prime rates down to 16%. Well, if we accept our responsibilities at the local and state levels, then let's look what's the classical mission of
Congressman Corkadale, would you like to come to the tape, please? Inquiry.
Hello, a comment from House Speaker General Corkadale on the activities of the 1982 regular session of the Alabama Legislature.
Yesterday, of course, we had a very pleasant day and a very interesting day with the President's visit. The Capitol is about back in its normal condition today with everyone back to work. Many of the changes that were necessary for the President's visit have been back to normal, and we're ready to go to work now on the 18th legislative day, which means that we only have 12 legislative days remaining after today. Yesterday, of course, we had a very pleasant day and a very interesting day with the President's visit. The Capitol is about back in its normal condition today with everyone back to work. Many of the changes that were necessary for the President's visit have been back to normal, and we're ready to go to work now on the 18th legislative day. Yesterday, of course, we had a very pleasant day and a very interesting day with the President's visit. The Capitol is about back in its normal condition today with everyone back to work. Many of the changes that were necessary for the President's visit have been back to normal, and we're ready to go to work now on the 18th legislative day, which means that we only have 12 legislative days remaining after today.
The issue was tabled from last month's board meeting, but today Barbara Murphy asked the board to approve the master's program. She says teachers are not allowed the option of earning a master's entirely in speech pathology and audiology, only in education. Mrs. Murphy says Alabama law requires that pathologists and audiologists working in clinics have master's degrees in speech pathology. She says the American Speech, Hearing, and Language Association says that pathologists and audiologists without a master's are inadequately trained. This morning, the board discussed at length whether the matter should be voted on today. State School Superintendent Wayne Teague asked that the issue be tabled for one more month and referred to the Ingram Committee for investigation and recommendation. But Mrs. Murphy disagreed because she's afraid that if it's sent to committee, the matter will be killed or compromised. After several more minutes of discussion, the board decided to address the issue today and voted unanimously for the master's program. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
You don't even write a picture. All right. Okay.
Watkins says he's received more than a dozen threatening phone calls from citizens who strongly oppose the gun control issue. He says many of the calls were life-threatening to both him and his children. Nevertheless, he says he's not afraid of the threats and vows to continue fighting for the gun control resolution. A public hearing on the issue is scheduled during next week's council meeting. In other action, the council approved the appointment of a new city attorney. The attorney, Herman Scott, a Cumberland Law School graduate, was recommended by Mayor Emery Farmer. The council approved the appointment on an 8-1 decision. Also, Mayor Farmer had a message from the city from President Reagan, who visited yesterday. The mayor said the president had nothing but praise for city employees for their efforts in making his trip a pleasant one, and also paid special tribute to members of the Montgomery Police Department in their security efforts. From City Hall, Dan Black, WSFA TV News. The attorney, Herman Scott, a Cumberland Law School graduate, was recommended by Mayor Emery Farmer. After a brief discussion and objection to the appointment from Councilman Joe Reed and Donald Watkins regarding background information on Scott, the council approved the appointment on an 8-1 vote. Earlier before the vote, Councilman Reed requested a biographical sketch on the mayor's candidate for the attorney's post, but the mayor told Reed copies of Scott's biographical information had been given to all council members. Watkins' objection came in his request for personnel information on a list of 4 other candidates for the job. However, Mayor Farmer quoted a section from the city code stating his authority in making such an appointment and said his choice of attorney Scott was the best, and it was up to the council to either approve or deny the appointment. In other business, the mayor had a message for the city from President Reagan concerning his visit yesterday. The mayor said the president had high praise for city employees for their efforts in making his trip a pleasant one, and also paid a special tribute to members of the Montgomery Police Department in their security efforts. From City Hall, Dan Black, WSFA TV News.
The Senate Finance and Taxation Committee acted in its usual fast manner and adopted an education budget that provides teachers with a larger increase. The administration had been contending that the education fund couldn't afford the larger increase, but F&T Committee Chairman Richmond Pearson made room by cutting increases offered by the administration to higher education by about 1% and by completely cutting out the funding for the Department of Youth Services. Finance Director Rex Rayner warned that he didn't think that youth services could be absorbed in the general fund as Pearson suggested. Meanwhile, the House was considering the general fund budget. The House leadership had earlier spent an extra money that was in the general fund that AEA forces had hoped to use to absorb the youth services program. The House leadership used that money to provide state employees with 12% rather than 10% pay hikes. That could have pitted the AEA forces against state employee forces, but education forces sidestepped that possible confrontation by cutting the increases to a number of state departments by a total of $8 million. That made room for youth services in the general fund and left the 12% teacher pay raise untouched. But by cutting those state departments to make room for DYS, the administration now contends that those state departments will be forced to either cut services or personnel in order to afford the 12% increase to those employees who are left after the cuts. The action on both budgets is still far from over. Earlier in the day, the Senate Banking and Insurance Committee approved a bill that would force hospitals to offer discounted rates equally. Blue Cross insurance officials oppose the bill since they are essentially the only insurance carrier that can currently get any discounts, usually around 14 or 16%. A slew of independent insurance carriers said they should be afforded the same opportunity. Blue Cross held that this bill would stop hospitals from offering any discounts and in turn force Blue Cross premiums to go up. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol. The battle isn't whether teachers and state employees deserve an increase, but instead how much of an increase and how the state will pay for it. Today, the AEA-backed forces who contend teachers deserve 16% rather than 14% pay raises were successful in getting that larger increase back into the education budget. It happened in the Senate Finance and Taxation Committee, where Chairman Richmond Pearson offered a handcrafted bill which afforded the larger increase by taking money from higher education and the entire amount budgeted for the Department of Youth Services. Pearson says DYS will be switched to the general fund budget. But Governor James' finance director Rex Rayner said transferring DYS to an already strained general fund budget would put the state's finances next year on the brink of disaster. Meanwhile, the House was debating the transfer of the DYS program to the general fund. AEA Floor Leader Roy Johnson offered an amendment that would slice more than $8 million from 16 state departments to make room for DYS and, in turn, preserve the 16% increase for teachers in the education budget. The James administration, which has the backing of the House leadership, contend the AEA-backed forces are turning their backs to responsible budgets just to get the support of teachers and state employees during an election year. They say the larger increases are stretching the general fund and education budgets to the point of possibly bursting into proration during economically hard times. But the AEA forces say their shuffling of programs, cuts in appropriation of dollars for operations, and some speculative growth projections will work out. So far, more than two-thirds of the legislature appears to think it will. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Issues you may wish to ask. Yes, please. Already for there to be revolutionary changes. I think there will be some elections which have already been set in. As soon as possible, one of my first objectives will be to visit all parts of the state, to meet with legislators in their homes, to get acquainted in much more detail than I've been able to so far with the three campuses of the system and with higher education in the state generally. One of the objectives that must be in the mind of any person assuming this responsibility at this point is the importance that the office of the Chancellor be a means of encouraging the strengthening and the progress of the three campuses in the system. In no sense is the role of the Chancellor to be a censor. It is to be a facilitator and a promoter to the continued advancement of these three great institutions. And the Office of the Chancellorship of the University of Alabama system were to come together. Let me stop there and try to respond to any particular in the directions which have already been set. Objectives of the Office of the Chancellor, as indeed this system as a whole, must be to participate in the development of the state in that regard.
Mainly for experience. I think I've worked on my swing for like a year. I took a year off, and the driving range is so different than the golf course. You have to really think, you have to, position yourself plus swing. So these tournaments just let me get the experience and make mistakes like today and just learn from experience, basically.
How are you doing money-wise?
I've made way over my expenses. I'm fine money-wise. I've got good sponsors, so I have no money problems at all. And it just gives me a chance to relax and just play.
Decided now that I'm going to remain at Georgia for next year.
Person said the next year, you discounting the year after that?
Yes, I never try to predict the future like I always say.
Herschel, you also just said that you don't want to step into a field that you feel you're not ready for yet. Now, that's the first time I've heard you say that you didn't believe you were ready for that field of pro football, when before you insinuated to me that you could play pro football. You're good enough to play in the big leagues right now.
Well, I said I could play in the Pro Football League, and I still think I can play in that league, but then if you really don't know whether you want to do it or not, you always got a question in your mind.
SPLC attorneys questioned two final witnesses, a grandmother, Helen H., and her granddaughter, Gina W. Helen H. testified that her granddaughter was sent to the home because of disciplinary problems, a point defense attorneys preyed upon during cross-examination, citing a number of specific incidents like smoking dope with friends. Helen said her granddaughter has attended several other schools for the same disciplinary reasons. She also testified that Gina's name was on an injunction presented to Bethesda officials by a sheriff. That injunction contained the names of girls who wanted to leave. Helen says she was told to pick up her granddaughter the next day. Then Gina W. took the stand. Gina said on the first day at Bethesda, September 22nd, 1981, she cried a lot, did not eat, and was warned by other girls. Gina W. testified that on the second day, she felt like she was being brainwashed. Gina said she was locked up and had no contact with the outside world. She told of one occasion where she was beaten 25 to 30 times with a 1.5 to 2-inch thick board. Gina says that beating left permanent marks on her buttocks and back legs. The first witness for the defense was Nancy M., also known as Beck. She was pregnant when she went to the home, and she described what life was like at the Bethesda Home for Girls. At the home, Nancy testified that girls were loved, cared for, and were not afraid. She said recreational activities included volleyball, swimming, walks, and dodgeball. Nancy says she was aware of what defense attorneys referred to as paddlings, but Nancy said she had never seen anyone paddled. The trial continues tomorrow. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News at the Federal Courthouse. Tomorrow, defense attorneys are expected to present more witnesses who've all been affiliated with the home. All are expected to describe what life was like at the Bethesda home. Today, the defense called their first witness to the stand, Nancy M. She testified that she needed a place to have her baby in private. She says she found that privacy at the Bethesda home. Nancy testified that girls at the home were loved and cared for, and no beliefs were forced on them. Nancy testified that she was aware of paddlings, a term defense attorneys referred to rather than beatings. But Nancy said she never saw anyone paddled. She said the rules at Bethesda included going to church, studying the Bible, and light chores. Because a number of girls at the home are pregnant, she said the home's officials made it an option for handling the babies for adoption. Nancy said the only difference she learned about the home when she got there was that the officials opened and read the girls' mail. Testimony continues tomorrow. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News at the Federal Courthouse.
Willie Chesson told police he slapped 7-month-old Monique Dixon several times because she wouldn't stop crying. Chesson was originally charged with child abuse, but when the baby died, the charge was upgraded.
He might have been real sleepy, and you have a 7-month-old baby that's crying and that's annoying, and he's trying to sleep, and he did say he felt unusual when he woke up, that, we could never get him to say what unusual meant, but he said he felt bad, that maybe the baby was just annoying him and would cry, and the more he'd spank it or hit it, the more it would cry. And
Dr. Richard Colin, a specialist in pediatric neurosurgery, testified that the beating of Monique Dixon was the worst case of child abuse he'd ever seen.
Well, Dr. Colin indicated that the child had been beaten so bad that all the brain was totally damaged, that normally in a car accident you'd get hit on one side of the head and it would paralyze a left arm or a left leg. Well, in this case, the baby was totally paralyzed and comatose.
Chesson will be sentenced in about 2 weeks. He could receive 10 years to life in prison. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News. Chesson doesn't have a criminal record. It's said he doesn't even have a bad temper, but he admits to injuring his girlfriend's baby, an injury that resulted in the infant's death.
The facts were pretty clear that he was living with the mother of the little 7-month-old baby, and that she would go to work on a regular basis around 7 in the morning, and that he in turn would stay there and then get up and take the baby over to his sister's place to babysit and so forth. Well, on this particular morning, the mother did get up and go to work at 7. The little baby awakened the defendant in this particular case, and everything from there on is mere speculation, except for the fact that he did admit spanking the baby and slapping the baby and hitting the baby with a belt.
Chesson could get 10 years to life for his conviction. Hawthorne says Chesson probably won't be a candidate for probation. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
Over 4 separate elections and over 50 separate campaigns, all of it totally nonviolent on the most controversial issues. But we have a phenomenal amount of support from the non-gay community and from bisexuals. Well, could go into Congress and point out the fact that if we legalize consenting adult legislation, that this is going to legalize sodomy and fornication and adultery and all these other issues, that it's insane that Congress is debating. They're more concerned with saving pre-birth and life hereafter than any concern for the people who exist already. And what we're saying is enough is enough. We're turning the whole thing around on putting this level out, put them into the nonsense issues or the real issues. Well, we won 63 out of 67 counties in Florida, and we had 80% of the public show up to changing the rules of the game from traditional liberal versus conservative politics into lifestyle versus intolerance, emotional sexual security versus insecurity. Up the tab, if they're not going to honor it and they're going to say that they're above the law, then how can we trust them on any other issue? Secondly, we feel that it's high time that we got them out of giving carte blanche to more waste and fraud and mismanagement in the military. I mean, when Mr. Reagan can come around and say that we need 17,000 more We are doing this as part of a national effort to dump Mr. Reagan and dump Mr. Falwell and dump the 281 members of Congress who sold out to repeal the Washington, D.C. consenting adult bill. These are the very issues that they argued in Congress that we defeated them on in Florida, Houston, and Austin. So what we're saying to the politicians and to government is either shape up or ship out. The public is tired. We want answers. And if we don't get you to meet the needs and get some quality in there, we'll have to vote you out. And we're taking that frustration out in the ballot this year in 1982 in the ballot box.
we need to concentrate on building a party that has the ability to develop and implement common sense solutions to the practical problems that we face as Alabamians.
Wall Street, one of the Wall Street law firms up there. I had practiced with a friend of George's named Ed Wells from Virginia Law School. He told me, said he
introduction. I remember that '78 campaign quite well, and I think one reason that Julian and I developed
Wall Street law firms up there. I had practiced with a friend of George's named Ed Wells from Virginia Law School. He told me.
The plant will be located in Mobile's Theodore Industrial Area. Plant President J.D. Hall says the facility will serve the petroleum industry throughout the United States and foreign countries. Hall says the plant, which should be ready to begin operations in about 2 years, will provide jobs for 350 people, most coming from the Mobile area. Hall Chemical has operated a facility in Arab, Alabama since 1967. Hall says the Mobile port is a perfect place to house another plant. This afternoon, Hall met with Governor Fob James, who lauded him for deciding to build another plant in the state. The governor says he supports the project 100%. Hall says the plant will require a capital investment of more than $40 million. He says the company will have some additional growth potential. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA, TV News.
We will take you at your word.
With anti- and pro-abortionists watching, the committee batted the bills around some time before acting on them. The primary concern over the bill prohibiting state dollars from paying for abortions wasn't abortion itself, but instead some possible side effects of the bill. Side effects like jeopardizing the state's share of federal Medicaid dollars, and concerns that the bill would only affect lower-income families who can't afford any other medical alternative. The second bill originally required 19-year-old or younger girls to have the permission of both her parents for an abortion, but was diluted to allow 18-year-old or younger girls only to notify one of her parents. In the House Ways and Means Committee, the committee approved a bill that will pay retired teachers $1.20 more each month for each year of active service. The bill also provides that same benefit to retired state employees. Both programs would cost the state almost $9 million. The committee also approved a bill creating a family court judge for Montgomery County, but the bill took an unusual method of creating the position. The funding is conditional, subject to the governor releasing the money if it's available. If the money isn't released, the seat is automatically created on the 1st of January, 1984. The first judge in the position will be appointed by the governor, with subsequent vacancies filled by election. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Next priority, research and education. Even though we have more than we need today, if we don't do the proper research, we do have a farm bill which calls for some reductions, and I've been talking to Mr. Myrick and others here about the problems that the farm bill and the acreage reduction program has for people in the southeast. We are conscious of that. We do believe that this program will be helpful, but it's not the major thing. We encourage you to participate if you possibly can. It's important that we reduce this acreage. But it is much more important that we expand our sales and our export promotions.
And I think one other thing, I wish the Secretary had left, because I'd like for him to pass it on to the State Department and to the Secretary Haig, is it if we'd stop talking about embargoes, I believe we'd be all a lot better off.
We're working very hard on that. Our next priority, research and education. Even though we have more than we need today, if we don't do the proper research, we do have a farm bill which calls for some reductions, and I've been talking to Mr. Myrick and others here about the problems that the farm bill and the acreage reduction program has for people in the southeast. We are conscious of that. We do believe that this program will be helpful, but it's not the major thing. We encourage you to participate if you possibly can. It's important that we reduce this acreage, but it is much more important that we expand our sales and our export promotions.
That it does provide that in the event that there is a embargo of agricultural products, that the government is going to have to pay the farmer a difference between the market price and 100% of profit, parity, and that the loan rate has to go up to 100% of parity. And the idea of that is to deter any selective embargo of agricultural products.